Case 1. Joseph R. Alexander. Pastor Joseph R. Alexander stood before his congregation every Sunday morning, his voice echoing through the sanctuary as he preached passionately about honesty, integrity, and trusting in God's provision for all their needs. His sermons on financial stewardship were particularly moving, often bringing tears to the eyes of faithful believers who hung on every word. But behind that polished pulpit presence and those inspiring messages about righteousness, Alexander was systematically forging checks and creating fictitious vendors to steal over $321,000 from the very people who trusted him with their tithes and offerings. For years, Alexander had built an impeccable reputation as a dedicated servant of God and pillar of his community. His journey into ministry began with genuine calling and authentic passion for serving others. Congregation members respected his apparent financial wisdom and gladly entrusted him with oversight of church accounts, believing their pastor's moral authority guaranteed responsible stewardship of their sacrificial donations meant to advance God's kingdom. The crime itself was breathtakingly systematic and calculated. Alexander didn't simply pocket loose cash from collection plates. He orchestrated an elaborate fraud scheme that demonstrated sophisticated criminal planning disguised as pastoral responsibility. He created completely fictitious vendor companies with professional-sounding names and fake documentation, then wrote church checks to these non-existent businesses while forging authorization signatures that made the transactions appear legitimate to casual observers. His method involved generating false invoices for services never rendered and products never delivered, creating paper trails that would fool basic auditing, while systematically draining church accounts over extended periods. Alexander's position provided perfect cover for his criminal activities, as congregation members naturally assumed their trusted pastor was handling legitimate ministry expenses rather than funding his personal lifestyle through elaborate theft. The investigation began when routine financial reviews revealed irregularities that couldn't be explained through normal ministry operations. Banking officials noticed unusual patterns in check writing and vendor payments that triggered federal attention, leading to forensic accounting that exposed the stunning scope of Alexander's deception. FBI agents discovered the fake vendor scheme and documented systematic forgery that proved criminal intent rather than accounting errors. Alexander's downfall came swiftly once federal investigators uncovered the evidence trail. His arrest shocked the congregation and broader community, who had trusted his spiritual authority for years. During trial proceedings, the full extent of his betrayal became clear as prosecutors revealed how he had weaponized his pastoral position to steal from faithful believers who had sacrificed their own financial security to support what they believed was legitimate ministry work. The consequences proved devastating on multiple levels. Alexander received 19 months in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution, though the financial damage paled compared to the spiritual devastation he caused. His congregation faced not only monetary loss but complete destruction of trust in religious leadership, creating lasting trauma that affected their relationship with faith itself, while proving that even the most convincing spiritual authority could conceal systematic criminal behavior. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we expose the shocking truth behind those who abuse positions of trust and authority. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon for notifications, because what you're about to witness will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about religious leadership and institutional trust. Today's investigation reveals 10 shocking cases of pastors who systematically stole from their own congregations, betraying the most sacred trust imaginable while exploiting the faith and generosity of vulnerable believers who sacrificed their own financial security, believing they were supporting God's work, rather than funding criminal enterprises disguised as ministry operations. Case 2. Wade Malloy. Wade Malloy built his reputation as a man of extraordinary dedication, serving simultaneously as both pastor of his congregation and administrator of their affiliated Christian school. His dual role created enormous respect within the community, where parents trusted him not only with their children's spiritual development, but also their educational future and the substantial tuition payments that funded the school's operations. Malloy's background appeared impeccable to those who knew him. He had worked his way up through church leadership, demonstrating apparent financial acumen and administrative skills that convinced the congregation he was the perfect choice to oversee both their spiritual and educational institutions. Parents felt blessed to have found a leader who could seamlessly integrate Christian values with quality education while maintaining the fiscal responsibility necessary to keep their school thriving. But behind this facade of dedicated service, Malloy was orchestrating a massive embezzlement scheme that would ultimately steal over $550,000 from both the church and school accounts. His crime wasn't opportunistic theft. It was systematic financial manipulation that diverted funds meant for children's education and congregational ministry into his personal lifestyle enhancement over an extended period of calculated deception. The embezzlement scheme involved sophisticated accounting manipulation that took advantage of Malloy's trusted position and access to multiple financial accounts. He systematically diverted school tuition payments, church donations, and ministry funds into personal expenses that had nothing to do with legitimate institutional operations. His dual role provided perfect cover, as parents and congregation members assumed their payments were supporting educational and spiritual activities rather than funding his undisclosed personal spending. Malloy's method included creating false expense categories and manipulating financial records to hide the systematic diversion of funds. He used his administrative authority to authorize payments to himself and cover personal expenses through institutional accounts, while presenting doctored financial reports that concealed the true scope of missing funds from oversight committees and concerned parents who trusted his stewardship. The investigation began when routine financial audits revealed discrepancies that couldn't be explained through normal operational expenses. Independent accountants brought in to examine the books discovered systematic irregularities that pointed to deliberate manipulation rather than accounting errors. The paper trail revealed extensive personal use of institutional funds that violated every principle of nonprofit financial management. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered evidence of systematic theft that spanned multiple years and affected both institutions under Malloy's oversight. Bank records revealed personal purchases, luxury expenses, and lifestyle maintenance costs that were being funded through money meant to educate children and support ministry activities. The scope of his deception shocked even experienced financial investigators. Malloy's downfall came when the evidence became overwhelming and undeniable. Faced with detailed financial documentation proving his systematic theft, he eventually pleaded guilty to embezzlement charges rather than face trial. His confession revealed the stunning scope of his betrayal and the calculated nature of his crimes against both congregation and school families. The consequences devastated multiple communities simultaneously. Malloy received a substantial prison sentence and was ordered to pay full restitution, though the financial damage created lasting hardship for families who had trusted their children's education and spiritual development to his care. The school faced potential closure while the congregation struggled with both monetary loss and complete destruction of trust in leadership, creating institutional trauma that affected hundreds of families who had believed they were supporting legitimate Christian education and ministry rather than funding systematic criminal theft disguised as dedicated service. Case 3. Gregory Neal. Gregory Neal occupied one of the most trusted positions within his church community: direct access to congregational finances and the sacred responsibility of managing the generous donations that faithful believers sacrificed from their own limited resources. His role required impeccable integrity and absolute trustworthiness, qualities that congregation members believed he possessed based on his spiritual leadership and apparent dedication to serving God's people through careful financial stewardship. Neal's background suggested he was perfectly suited for handling church finances. He had demonstrated administrative competence and earned respect through years of faithful service that convinced leadership he could be trusted with their most sensitive financial responsibilities. Congregation members felt secure knowing their tithes and offerings were being managed by someone who understood both the spiritual significance and practical requirements of proper stewardship. But Neal's position of trust became the perfect cover for systematic theft that would ultimately steal $129,960.00 from the very people who had entrusted him with their sacrificial giving. His crime involved two primary methods: unauthorized withdrawals directly from church accounts and systematic abuse of church credit cards for personal expenses that had nothing to do with legitimate ministry operations. The unauthorized withdrawal scheme was brazen in its simplicity, yet devastating in its impact. Neal used his legitimate access to church banking systems to systematically transfer funds into his personal accounts, creating false documentation that made these transactions appear authorized when they were actually calculated theft. His position provided him with the passwords, account numbers, and administrative authority necessary to move money without immediate detection. Simultaneously, Neal was conducting systematic credit card abuse that funded his personal lifestyle through church payment systems. He made personal purchases, paid for entertainment expenses, and covered his own bills using credit cards that were meant exclusively for legitimate ministry expenses. The scope of his credit card fraud demonstrated calculated planning rather than impulsive spending mistakes. Neal's criminal methodology relied heavily on his trusted position and the natural assumption that someone in church financial leadership would never abuse that sacred responsibility. He manipulated accounting systems to disguise his theft, created false expense categories to justify unauthorized spending, and took advantage of the fact that church financial oversight was often limited due to trust in spiritual leadership. The investigation began when banking irregularities triggered automatic alerts that couldn't be ignored or explained through normal ministry operations. Financial institutions noticed unusual patterns in withdrawals and credit card usage that prompted closer examination of church accounts. Forensic accounting revealed systematic theft that had been occurring over extended periods while disguised as legitimate expenses. As investigators examined the evidence, they discovered a clear paper trail showing Neal's deliberate manipulation of church financial systems for personal gain. Bank records, credit card statements, and accounting documents proved that he had systematically stolen from congregation donations while maintaining the appearance of faithful stewardship. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Neal's downfall came swiftly once federal authorities became involved in the investigation. The systematic nature of his theft, combined with the use of banking systems and credit cards, elevated his crimes to federal jurisdiction, where penalties are significantly more severe than local charges. His position of trust within a religious organization actually increased rather than decreased the legal consequences he faced. The federal prosecution resulted in Neal being sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release, along with orders for complete restitution of the stolen funds. But the consequences extended far beyond his personal punishment to include devastating damage to congregational trust and financial stability. The congregation faced not only the immediate financial loss of nearly $130,000, but also the long-term challenge of rebuilding their financial systems and restoring confidence in church leadership. Neal's betrayal created lasting trauma within the community, as faithful believers who had sacrificed their own financial security to support what they believed was God's work discovered their generosity had been systematically exploited by the very person they trusted to protect it. His crimes proved that even the most sacred financial trust could be weaponized for personal gain when criminal intent masqueraded as spiritual authority. Case 4. Whitney Foster. Whitney Foster possessed something that made him extraordinarily dangerous to religious institutions. Extensive real estate knowledge combined with access to church property records and the trust of congregation members who believed their pastor would never exploit his position for personal financial gain. His understanding of property law, deed transfers, and real estate procedures created the perfect storm for what would become one of the most audacious church theft schemes ever documented. Foster's background in real estate gave him sophisticated understanding of property transactions that most congregation members lacked completely. His expertise made him the natural choice when churches needed guidance on property matters, renovations, or facility expansions. Community members respected his apparent business acumen and gladly sought his advice on their own real estate decisions, never suspecting that his knowledge was being weaponized against their own institutions. But Foster's real estate expertise became the foundation for a criminal scheme so bold it defied belief. Instead of simply stealing cash or manipulating financial accounts like other criminal pastors, Foster targeted the most valuable assets churches possessed, their actual property holdings. His crime involved filing completely fraudulent deeds that would transfer ownership of multiple church properties directly into his personal control. The fraudulent deed scheme required sophisticated planning and detailed knowledge of property law that Foster possessed through his real estate background. He created false documentation that appeared legitimate to casual observers, while systematically stealing church properties worth potentially millions of dollars. His method involved forging signatures, creating fake authorization documents, and filing fraudulent paperwork with government offices that handle property transfers. Foster's criminal methodology was breathtakingly audacious because it targeted the most fundamental asset that religious congregations possess. Churches invest decades building equity in their facilities, often through sacrificial giving from multiple generations of faithful believers who scrimp and save to pay off mortgages and fund facility improvements. Foster's scheme threatened to steal not just money, but the actual buildings where congregations worshipped and conducted their spiritual lives. The scope of Foster's property theft involved multiple church facilities, suggesting this wasn't opportunistic crime but systematic criminal enterprise designed to steal maximum value through real estate fraud. His scheme required accessing confidential property records, forging official documents, and manipulating government filing systems while maintaining his pastoral facade and the trust of congregation members who had no idea their church buildings were being stolen from under them. The investigation began when church leaders discovered irregularities in property ownership records that couldn't be explained through any legitimate transactions. Legal challenges to the fraudulent deeds revealed systematic forgery and document manipulation that proved criminal intent rather than administrative errors. Property record investigations uncovered evidence of deliberate fraud designed to transfer church assets into Foster's personal ownership. As investigators examined the evidence, they discovered the stunning scope of Foster's real estate fraud and the sophisticated planning required to execute such audacious theft. The fraudulent deeds represented not just property theft, but a complete betrayal of the sacred trust between pastors and congregations, proving that even the most fundamental church assets weren't safe from criminal exploitation by trusted spiritual leaders. Foster's downfall came when the evidence of systematic property fraud became overwhelming and undeniable. His conviction on felony theft charges reflected the serious nature of his crimes and the devastating impact on religious communities who faced losing their actual church buildings to fraudulent property transfers. The legal proceedings revealed the calculated nature of his scheme and the extensive planning required to execute such sophisticated real estate fraud. The consequences were devastating on multiple levels that extended far beyond typical financial crime. Foster received an extraordinary 35-year prison sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the massive value of the properties he attempted to steal. But the legal punishment was only the beginning of the damage caused by his audacious property theft scheme. The affected congregations faced not only potential loss of their church buildings, but also enormous legal costs to restore proper ownership and undo the fraudulent property transfers. Foster's crimes created institutional trauma that threatened the very existence of religious communities, while proving that no church asset was safe from criminal exploitation when real estate knowledge was weaponized against trusting believers who never suspected their pastor would attempt to literally steal their houses of worship. Case 5. Jerome I. Hurley. Jerome I. Hurley held a position that required absolute integrity during one of the most vulnerable moments in any religious community's existence, managing insurance claims after catastrophic damage to church property. When disaster strikes a house of worship, congregation members depend completely on their leadership to handle insurance procedures with transparency and dedication to restoring their sacred space. Hurley's role demanded unwavering trustworthiness during a crisis when faithful believers were already emotionally and financially devastated. Hurley's background positioned him perfectly to handle complex insurance matters that most congregation members couldn't navigate themselves. His apparent understanding of insurance procedures and claims processes made him the natural choice to represent the church's interests with insurance companies and government agencies. Community members felt relieved to have someone knowledgeable managing the complicated paperwork and negotiations required to rebuild their damaged facilities. But what should have been faithful stewardship during a crisis became systematic fraud that would steal $347,000 from insurance funds meant to restore the church while simultaneously engaging in tax evasion that compounded his criminal behavior. Hurley's scheme involved diverting an insurance payout that was specifically designated for church restoration into his personal accounts while manipulating tax documents to hide his theft from federal authorities. The insurance diversion scheme was particularly cruel because it exploited congregation members during their most vulnerable moment. When churches suffer catastrophic damage from fires, storms, or other disasters, the insurance payout represents hope for restoration and recovery. Faithful believers often increase their giving to supplement insurance funds, believing their sacrificial donations will help rebuild their house of worship faster and better than before. Hurley's criminal methodology involved intercepting the $347,000 insurance settlement that was meant to repair church damage and systematically transferring those funds into accounts under his personal control. His position gave him legitimate access to insurance communications and settlement procedures, providing perfect cover for diverting money that desperate congregation members were counting on to restore their spiritual home. The tax evasion component of Hurley's crimes demonstrated calculated criminal planning rather than opportunistic theft. By failing to report the stolen insurance funds as income, he attempted to avoid federal tax obligations while hiding evidence of his theft from government oversight. This dual criminal strategy showed sophisticated understanding of both insurance fraud and tax law violations. The investigation began when insurance company representatives and church leadership noticed discrepancies between settlement amounts and actual reconstruction funding available for church repairs. Insurance companies maintained detailed records of claim payments and became suspicious when inquiries revealed that designated restoration funds had been diverted away from their intended purpose. As investigators examined the financial trail, they discovered systematic diversion of insurance funds, combined with deliberate tax evasion designed to hide the theft from federal authorities. The Maryland Attorney General's office became involved when the scope of fraud became clear, revealing how Hurley had exploited both insurance systems and tax regulations while betraying congregation members during their crisis. Hurley's downfall came when the evidence of systematic insurance fraud and tax evasion became overwhelming. His scheme had created a clear paper trail showing deliberate diversion of funds meant for church restoration, combined with tax documents that proved his attempts to hide the stolen money from federal oversight. The dual nature of his crimes elevated the legal consequences significantly. The legal consequences reflected both the financial damage and the particularly cruel nature of exploiting congregation members during a crisis. Hurley received a suspended jail sentence combined with 5 years of probation, along with orders for complete restitution of the diverted insurance funds. However, the probation terms included strict oversight designed to prevent future financial crimes. But the consequences extended far beyond Hurley's personal punishment. to include devastating impact on a congregation already struggling with disaster recovery. The diverted insurance funds created additional financial hardship for church members who were already dealing with the emotional trauma of losing their worship space. Hurley's betrayal meant that faithful believers faced not only the original disaster, but also the secondary trauma of discovering that their trusted leader had stolen the money meant to restore their spiritual home, creating lasting damage to both their facility and their faith in religious leadership during their most desperate hour of need. Case 6. Barry Minkow. Barry Minkow's story represents one of the most shocking examples of how a celebrity conversion narrative can be weaponized to commit massive financial fraud against trusting religious communities. His transformation from convicted white-collar criminal to celebrated born-again Christian pastor created the perfect cover for what would become a $3 million embezzlement scheme that exploited the very people who believed his redemption story and trusted him with their sacrificial donations. Minkow's background was already notorious in financial crime circles long before he entered ministry. During the 1980s, he had orchestrated one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in American history through his company ZZZZ Best, which was eventually exposed as an elaborate Ponzi scheme that cost investors hundreds of millions of dollars. His conviction and imprisonment should have ended his ability to exploit public trust, but instead became the foundation for an even more devastating criminal career. His prison conversion to Christianity created a compelling redemption narrative that resonated powerfully with evangelical communities eager to believe in the transformative power of faith. Minkow's articulate testimony about finding God behind bars and his apparent remorse for past crimes convinced religious leaders that he represented authentic spiritual transformation worthy of ministry opportunities and congregational trust. But Minkow's celebrity conversion was actually sophisticated preparation for his next criminal enterprise. His ministry position provided access to faithful believers who were naturally inclined to trust someone with such a dramatic salvation story. His past fraud experience, combined with newfound religious authority, created the perfect storm for systematic exploitation of congregational generosity on an unprecedented scale. The $3 million embezzlement scheme demonstrated that Minkow had never abandoned his criminal methodology, but had simply adapted it to exploit religious communities instead of corporate investors. His theft involved systematically diverting donations that congregation members sacrificed from their own limited resources, believing their generous giving was supporting legitimate ministry work rather than funding the lifestyle of a career criminal disguised as a redeemed pastor. Minkow's criminal methodology relied heavily on his celebrity status within evangelical circles and the natural assumption that someone with such a public conversion story would never return to criminal behavior. He manipulated accounting systems to disguise his theft, created false ministry expenses to justify unauthorized spending, and took advantage of religious communities' tendency to trust spiritual authority without demanding the financial transparency required in secular organizations. The scope of his theft was staggering, not just in dollar amount, but in the systematic nature of his exploitation. $3 million represents thousands of individual donations from working families, elderly believers on fixed incomes, and young couples sacrificing their own financial security to support what they believed was God's work. Minkow's scheme stole not just money, but also the sacred trust that makes religious community possible. The investigation began when FBI agents, who were already familiar with Minkow's previous criminal history, noticed financial irregularities that suggested he had returned to fraudulent behavior despite his public conversion claims. Federal investigators brought sophisticated financial crime expertise to bear on his ministry operations, uncovering systematic theft that proved his redemption narrative was elaborate deception. As the FBI investigation progressed, agents discovered evidence proving that Minkow had never truly abandoned his criminal career, but had simply found a new victim pool through religious ministry. The complex financial tracking required to document his $3 million theft revealed systematic exploitation that spanned extended periods while he maintained his facade as a transformed spiritual leader. Minkow's downfall came when federal evidence became overwhelming and undeniable. His arrest shocked evangelical communities who had embraced his conversion story and trusted him with their spiritual and financial lives. The trial proceedings revealed the calculated nature of his deception and the devastating scope of his betrayal of religious trust. The federal prosecution resulted in Minkow receiving a 5-year prison sentence, along with orders for massive restitution payments that would likely take decades to complete. But his legal punishment represented only the beginning of the damage caused by his systematic exploitation of religious faith. The consequences devastated not only his immediate congregation, but also the broader evangelical community that had celebrated his conversion as proof of Christianity's transformative power. Minkow's crimes created lasting skepticism about celebrity conversion stories, while proving that even the most compelling redemption narratives could be elaborate deceptions designed to exploit the very faith communities that offered grace, forgiveness, and second chances to those claiming spiritual transformation. Case 7. Dr. Charles J. Southall. Dr. Charles J. Southall III carried impressive academic credentials and a distinguished title that commanded automatic respect within religious and educational circles. His doctoral degree and professional reputation created an aura of intellectual authority that made congregation members feel privileged to have such an accomplished leader overseeing their spiritual and financial affairs. His academic background suggested the analytical skills and ethical foundation necessary for responsible stewardship of charitable donations. Southall's respected ministry position combined with his educational achievements to create perfect credibility for handling large-scale donor contributions and complex financial transactions. Wealthy benefactors and institutional donors felt confident in trusting substantial gifts to someone with both spiritual authority and apparent academic integrity. His sophisticated understanding of financial systems made him the natural choice for managing complicated donation structures and multi-layered funding arrangements. But behind his impressive credentials and scholarly reputation, Southall was orchestrating one of the most sophisticated church fraud schemes ever documented. His crime involved systematically diverting $889,565.00 in donor funds through elaborate fraud and money laundering operations that demonstrated criminal financial expertise worthy of organized crime syndicates rather than religious ministry. The donor fund diversion scheme required extensive planning and sophisticated understanding of financial systems that Southall possessed through his academic background and ministry experience. His method involved intercepting substantial donations that wealthy benefactors intended for legitimate charitable purposes, then channeling those funds through complex money laundering operations designed to obscure the theft while making the stolen money appear to come from legitimate sources. Southall's money laundering operations demonstrated criminal sophistication that went far beyond simple embezzlement or opportunistic theft. His scheme involved multiple financial institutions, complex transaction structures, and elaborate documentation designed to create false paper trails that would confuse investigators and hide the systematic diversion of charitable donations into his personal accounts. The scope of his fraud extended beyond individual theft to include systematic exploitation of the entire donor relationship structure that religious organizations depend upon for major funding. Wealthy benefactors who trusted Southall with substantial charitable gifts believed their generosity was supporting legitimate ministry work, educational programs, and community service initiatives rather than funding elaborate criminal enterprises disguised as religious activity. Southall's criminal methodology relied on his dual authority as both academic professional and spiritual leader to manipulate wealthy donors who naturally assumed someone with such impressive credentials would handle their charitable gifts with absolute integrity. His sophisticated understanding of financial systems allowed him to create complex fraud structures that would fool casual oversight while systematically stealing nearly $900,000 over extended periods. The federal investigation began when banking irregularities triggered alerts that sophisticated money laundering operations were being conducted through accounts associated with religious organizations. Federal financial crime units brought extensive expertise to bear on Southall's complex fraud scheme, uncovering systematic money laundering that proved criminal intent rather than accounting errors or administrative mistakes. As investigators examined the evidence, they discovered that Southall had created elaborate financial structures designed specifically to hide systematic theft of donor contributions. The money laundering operations involved multiple banks, complex transaction patterns, and sophisticated documentation that demonstrated extensive criminal planning rather than opportunistic theft. The investigation revealed that Southall's academic credentials and professional reputation had been systematically weaponized to exploit wealthy donors who trusted his apparent integrity and competence. Federal agents discovered that his impressive educational background had actually provided him with the knowledge necessary to create sophisticated fraud schemes rather than serving the charitable purposes that donors intended to support. Southall's downfall came when federal prosecutors assembled overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud and money laundering that proved his criminal operations extended far beyond simple embezzlement. His arrest shocked academic and religious communities who had trusted his scholarly reputation and professional credentials without suspecting that his expertise was being used for criminal rather than charitable purposes. The federal prosecution resulted in Southall receiving 60 months in federal prison, reflecting both the substantial dollar amount of his theft and the sophisticated criminal methodology he employed to steal donor funds. His sentence demonstrated that academic credentials and professional reputation provided no protection from serious legal consequences when used to facilitate major financial crimes. The consequences extended far beyond Southall's personal punishment, to include devastating damage to donor confidence in religious organizations and charitable giving structures. His sophisticated fraud scheme created lasting skepticism among wealthy benefactors, who discovered that even the most impressive academic and spiritual credentials could mask elaborate criminal operations designed to exploit charitable generosity for personal enrichment rather than legitimate ministry purposes. Case 8. William Neal Gallagher. William Neal "Doc" Gallagher earned his nickname through decades of building trust as a respected advisor within religious and retirement communities, where his apparent wisdom and spiritual authority made him the perfect confidant for elderly believers seeking guidance on their life savings and investment decisions. Both in New York, and his reputation as a trustworthy counselor created the ideal foundation for what would become one of the most devastating Ponzi schemes ever perpetrated against church communities and vulnerable retirees. Gallagher's background positioned him perfectly to exploit the intersection of religious faith and retirement planning that represents the most vulnerable moment in many believers' financial lives. Elderly congregation members naturally turned to him for advice on managing their nest eggs, believing that someone with both spiritual authority and apparent investment expertise would guide them toward financial security during their golden years, rather than systematic exploitation. His trusted advisor role within retirement communities gave him unprecedented access to elderly investors who possessed substantial savings accumulated over decades of hard work and careful planning. These retirees represented ideal victims for financial fraud because they often lacked sophisticated understanding of modern investment schemes while possessing exactly the kind of liquid assets that Ponzi operators need to sustain their criminal enterprises. But what appeared to be wise investment counsel was actually an elaborate Ponzi scheme designed to steal millions from the very people who trusted Gallagher with their life savings. His crime involved promising unrealistic returns on investments while using new investor money to pay existing investors, creating the illusion of profitable returns while systematically stealing the principal investments of trusting retirees and church members. Gallagher's Ponzi methodology followed the classic criminal pattern, but was particularly devastating because it targeted elderly believers who could never recover financially from such losses. His scheme involved convincing retirees to invest their life savings in what he claimed were safe, high-return opportunities specifically designed for conservative investors seeking steady income during retirement years. The targeting of church investors and retirees made Gallagher's scheme especially cruel because these victims possessed exactly the characteristics that made recovery impossible. Elderly investors who lose their life savings to Ponzi schemes rarely have the time or earning capacity to rebuild their financial security, meaning Gallagher's theft condemned his victims to poverty during their most vulnerable years. Gallagher's criminal operations required sophisticated manipulation of both financial systems and personal relationships built over years of apparent trustworthiness. His Ponzi scheme involved creating false investment documents, fabricating returns that convinced existing investors to recruit new victims, and maintaining elaborate deception that made his criminal enterprise appear legitimate to victims who trusted his spiritual authority. The investigation began when the Texas State Board and other regulatory agencies noticed irregularities in investment structures that suggested possible securities fraud targeting vulnerable populations. Investigators discovered that Gallagher's promised returns were mathematically impossible through legitimate investments, proving that his operations constituted systematic fraud rather than poor investment performance. As investigators examined the evidence, they uncovered the full scope of Gallagher's Ponzi operations and the devastating impact on elderly victims who had trusted their life savings to his care. The scheme had stolen millions from retirees and church investors who faced financial ruin during their golden years, creating human suffering that extended far beyond monetary loss to include complete destruction of retirement security. CBS News and other media outlets documented the heartbreaking stories of elderly victims who discovered their life savings had been stolen by someone they trusted completely. The investigation revealed systematic exploitation of religious authority and retirement community relationships that proved how Ponzi schemes could be weaponized against the most vulnerable populations through manipulation of spiritual trust. Gallagher's downfall came when his Ponzi scheme inevitably collapsed under its own mathematical impossibility, leaving hundreds of elderly victims facing financial devastation during their retirement years. His arrest and prosecution revealed the stunning scope of his betrayal and the calculated nature of his exploitation of religious and retirement communities. The legal consequences reflected both the massive financial damage and the particularly vulnerable nature of his victim population. Gallagher pleaded guilty to federal charges and received a long-term prison sentence, along with orders for multi-million-dollar restitution payments that would likely never fully compensate his victims for their stolen life savings. But the consequences extended far beyond legal punishment to include devastating human suffering among elderly victims who faced poverty during their final years because they trusted someone with apparent spiritual authority and investment expertise. Gallagher's crimes destroyed not only individual retirement security, but also community trust in financial advisors and religious leaders, creating lasting trauma among vulnerable populations who discovered that even their most trusted spiritual counselors could systematically exploit their life savings through elaborate criminal schemes disguised as conservative investment opportunities designed specifically for elderly believers seeking financial security during retirement. Case 9. Lamor Whitehead. Lamor Whitehead built his public persona around flashy displays of wealth and success, using social media platforms to showcase expensive jewelry, luxury cars, and designer clothing that he claimed demonstrated God's financial blessings on his ministry. His ostentatious lifestyle and charismatic online presence attracted followers who believed his prosperity represented authentic divine favor and proof that generous giving to his ministry would unlock similar supernatural provision in their own lives. Whitehead's background combined street credibility with religious authority in ways that resonated powerfully with urban communities seeking both spiritual guidance and financial breakthrough. His transformation story from troubled past to prosperous pastor created compelling narrative that convinced vulnerable believers he possessed special insight into achieving both spiritual and material success through faith-based principles. His social media presence amplified his influence exponentially, reaching thousands of potential victims who saw his displays of wealth as evidence of ministerial anointing rather than warning signs of criminal behavior. Whitehead's flashy lifestyle became a recruitment tool that attracted desperate believers seeking supranational solutions to their financial struggles, making them perfect targets for systematic exploitation disguised as spiritual mentorship. But behind the expensive suits and luxury accessories, Whitehead was orchestrating systematic fraud schemes that specifically targeted elderly and vulnerable parishioners through manipulation of their desperate financial circumstances. His crimes involved defrauding an elderly congregation member while engaging in extortion tactics designed to extract money from victims who trusted his spiritual authority and believed his promises of divine intervention. The elderly fraud component of Whitehead's criminal enterprise demonstrated particular cruelty because it exploited senior citizens during their most vulnerable years, when fixed incomes and limited resources made financial recovery virtually impossible. His targeting of elderly parishioners showed calculated predatory behavior that weaponized pastoral authority against those least able to protect themselves from sophisticated manipulation. Whitehead's extortion tactics involved using his ministerial position to create psychological pressure that convinced victims they had no choice but to comply with his financial demands. His method combined spiritual manipulation with intimidation techniques that made vulnerable believers feel they were spiritually obligated to provide money for his personal enrichment rather than legitimate ministry purposes. The pattern of manipulation involved convincing victims that their financial difficulties could only be resolved through generous giving to his ministry, creating psychological dependency that made systematic exploitation appear to be spiritual solution rather than criminal theft. Whitehead's charismatic authority provided perfect cover for extortion schemes that exploited desperate believers' hope for supernatural financial breakthrough. His criminal methodology relied heavily on the vulnerability of congregation members who faced genuine financial crises and were willing to try anything that promised divine intervention. Whitehead's prosperity gospel message convinced desperate believers that sacrificial giving to his ministry would unlock God's multiplication, when actually their donations were funding his luxury lifestyle while their own circumstances remained unchanged or worsened. The investigation began when victims courageously came forward to report Whitehead's systematic manipulation and financial exploitation, despite their fear of spiritual retaliation or community judgment. Their cooperation with law enforcement revealed patterns of elder fraud and extortion that proved criminal intent rather than legitimate ministry activities. As investigators examined the evidence, they discovered systematic exploitation of vulnerable parishioners through manipulation of religious authority and spiritual coercion. The investigation revealed that Whitehead's flashy lifestyle was being funded through criminal schemes rather than legitimate ministry income, proving that his displays of wealth represented stolen money rather than divine blessing. The high-profile nature of Whitehead's arrest generated significant media attention that exposed the systematic exploitation occurring within prosperity gospel ministries. CNN, NBC News, and other major outlets documented how his crimes represented broader patterns of religious fraud that target vulnerable populations through manipulation of spiritual authority and false promises of supernatural provision. Whitehead's downfall came when the evidence of systematic fraud and extortion became overwhelming and undeniable. His arrest shocked followers who had believed his prosperity represented divine favor rather than criminal behavior, revealing how effectively religious authority could disguise systematic exploitation of vulnerable believers. The legal prosecution resulted in Whitehead being convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to a substantial prison term that reflected both the financial damage and the vulnerable nature of his victim population. His conviction demonstrated that flashy religious displays and social media influence provided no protection from serious legal consequences when used to facilitate elder fraud and extortion. The consequences extended far beyond Whitehead's personal punishment to include complete destruction of his public ministry and lasting damage to his followers' trust in religious leadership. His crimes created skepticism about prosperity gospel promises, while proving that even the most charismatic spiritual authority could systematically exploit vulnerable believers through criminal schemes disguised as divine intervention, leaving elderly victims facing financial ruin during their golden years because they trusted someone who weaponized their faith for personal enrichment rather than authentic spiritual service. Case 10. Curtis Frank Lemons. Curtis Frank Lemons held the ultimate position of financial trust within his congregation, direct oversight responsibility for church funds and the authority to authorize legitimate ministry expenses. His role required absolute integrity and unwavering commitment to stewarding the sacrificial donations that faithful believers contributed from their own limited resources, trusting that their pastor would handle every dollar with the same care they would show their own family's finances. Lemon's background appeared to qualify him perfectly for handling significant financial responsibilities within the church structure. Congregation members respected his apparent business acumen and administrative competence, believing that someone in pastoral leadership would naturally possess both the moral character and practical wisdom necessary to manage substantial church funds with complete transparency and accountability. His financial oversight position gave him legitimate access to church banking systems, signature authority for major expenditures, and the trust of congregation members who assumed their pastor would never abuse such sacred responsibility. The congregation felt secure knowing that someone with spiritual authority was protecting their generous donations from any form of misuse or inappropriate expenditure. But Lemon's position of ultimate financial trust became the perfect cover for what would prove to be brazen theft that demonstrated shocking disregard for both legal boundaries and spiritual responsibilities. His crime was stunning in its simplicity and audacity. He issued himself a $200,000 cashier's check directly from church funds. Using his legitimate authority to authorize what was actually systematic theft disguised as routine financial transactions. The cashier's check scheme was particularly brazen because it involved using official banking procedures to steal a massive amount of money in a single transaction, rather than attempting to hide theft through multiple smaller withdrawals that might avoid detection. Lemon's method showed either remarkable criminal confidence or complete disregard for the inevitable consequences of such obvious theft. The $200,000 amount represented an enormous sum for most church communities, likely equivalent to months or even years of faithful congregation giving that had been sacrificed by working families, elderly believers on fixed incomes, and young couples stretching their budgets to support what they believed was legitimate ministry work rather than pastoral theft. Lemon's criminal methodology relied entirely on his legitimate authority and the natural assumption that someone in pastoral leadership would never abuse their financial responsibilities so blatantly. His position provided him with the signature authority and banking access necessary to issue the fraudulent cashier's check without immediate oversight or approval from other church leaders. The investigation began when routine banking procedures revealed that a massive cashier's check had been issued from church accounts to Lemons personally, creating an obvious red flag that couldn't be explained through any legitimate ministry expense or authorized pastoral compensation. Banking officials immediately recognized the transaction as highly suspicious and reported it to appropriate authorities. As investigators examined the evidence, they discovered that Lemons had used his legitimate financial authority to steal $200,000 in a single, brazen transaction that showed complete disregard for both legal consequences and the devastating impact on his congregation. The clear evidence trail made prosecution straightforward, as there was no ambiguity about his criminal intent or the systematic nature of his theft. The investigation revealed that Lemon's crime represented one of the most audacious examples of pastoral financial abuse because of its brazen nature and the massive amount stolen in a single transaction. His method showed either remarkable criminal arrogance or complete failure to understand that such obvious theft would inevitably result in immediate detection and prosecution. Lemon's downfall came swiftly once the fraudulent cashier's check was discovered, as the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. His crime created a clear paper trail that proved systematic theft rather than administrative error, making prosecution inevitable and conviction virtually certain, given the obvious nature of his criminal behavior. The Ventura County District Attorney's Office prosecuted Lemons for his brazen theft, resulting in his guilty plea and sentencing to 2 years in state prison, along with orders for complete restitution of the stolen funds. His conviction demonstrated that even pastoral authority provided no protection from serious legal consequences when used to facilitate such obvious criminal behavior. The consequences devastated his congregation both financially and spiritually, as faithful believers faced not only the immediate loss of $200,000, but also complete destruction of trust in pastoral leadership. Lemon's crime was particularly traumatic because its brazen nature made clear that he had no regard for the spiritual significance of his position or the sacrificial nature of the donations he stole. The congregation struggled not only with the financial impact of losing such a substantial amount, but also with the psychological trauma of discovering that someone they trusted with their most sacred financial responsibilities had systematically betrayed that trust through obvious criminal behavior. Lemon's brazen theft proved that even the most trusted pastoral authority could weaponize legitimate financial access for personal enrichment, creating lasting damage to both institutional finances and congregational faith in religious leadership that extended far beyond the immediate monetary loss to include fundamental questions about spiritual authority and institutional accountability. These 10 shocking cases expose a terrifying truth that extends far beyond individual criminal behavior into systematic exploitation that has transformed religious authority into one of the most effective tools for financial predation in modern society. After witnessing these 10 devastating betrayals of sacred trust, which case shocked you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Savage Case Files for more shocking investigations that expose the dark truth behind those who abuse positions of trust and authority.